So, hi everybody. Welcome to this summer's course of 4350 Contemporary Legal Issues for the Criminal Justice Professional, which is just an extremely long name for how do you go into criminal justice? What are your limitations? What are you permitted to do? What are you not permitted to do? And ultimately, why? Why are there such limitations? That is what this class is all about. So before I get into the first lecture, I want to advise you all to go ahead and watch the introductory video, which explains some of the requirements for the class and gets into like some nitty-gritty details. But that's not part of this video. This video is all about lecturing on chapter 1, which let me go ahead and share my screen. You all should see this beautiful PowerPoint. And there we go. So all of you have chapter 1 within the first week's module. I provide all the chapters as a PDF. They're there for you. So go ahead and explore chapter 1, but know that if I don't lecture about it, then it's not going to be tested on. So if you come across something in the chapter that I have not tackled, then I don't want to say ignore it, but ignore it. Because if I don't talk about it, then it's not going to be on the exam, okay? So in the summer session, we go pretty quick. So I try to hit on what I think are some of the most vital concepts to you as a future CJ professional. So again, make sure that you review the introductory video, which explores the syllabus, explores the requirements of this course. But today we're going to look at the historical context, meaning the roots, the foundation of the United States Constitution, which as a CJ professional is your Bible. That document, that amazing document, tells you what you can do, what you can't do. And today we're going to discuss why. Why can't you do certain things? And why can you do certain things, right? So we're going to look at all of those different facets regarding that amazingly beautiful document known as, drumroll please, the Bill of Rights. All right. So how did it all begin? That's how far back we're going, guys. I think it's imperative that you all understand how we came to have one of the oldest surviving constitutional documents in the entire world, despite the fact we're one of the youngest nations. That says something. What it reflects is that this document is a conglomeration of thoughts and ideas that gave birth to democracy for our country, which at that time, think about it. Prior to that time, we had been under subjugation of a king. Nobody, not even a twinkle in their eye, not even the founding fathers, had considered a democracy up until really right after the United States Revolution. In fact, fun fact, did you know that after the United States Revolution, which spoiler alert, we won, we almost had a king. We actually asked George Washington, who was ultimately our first United States president, to be king, and he said no. And I'll tackle that here in a second. But it is indeed the oldest surviving oldest surviving constitution out of the entire world. Now think about that. We're not an old country, guys. We are extremely young compared to other countries that have been around for centuries, right? So we're the toddlers of the westernized world, but yet we can brag that we have one of the oldest surviving constitutional documents. But it all started before we even became the United States of America. We consisted of only 13 colonies. That was it. And we were considered inferior, insignificant, the very pedestrian, so to speak. Because at that time, it didn't matter what you had accomplished in your life. You were what your born into status was. So if you were born as a pauper into a family of paupers, meaning impoverished individuals, then you were always going to be that. You could never excel or rise in terms of status. In fact, Benjamin Franklin was the son of a candlestick maker. He had, I believe, 13 brothers and sisters. Grew up extremely poor, but yet grew up to be one of the most well-educated, articulate, or linguistic. He knew numerous languages, represented the colonies around the entire world, was also known as quite the ladies' man, but yet never was given the respect by the king or the royals at that time because he was the son of a candlestick maker, right? So the colonists in particular within America were looked down upon. They weren't considered of any prestigious status because we are under a monarchy, the rule of a king. It wasn't until Britain made what I like to call 3 dumb mistakes. Bum, bum, bum. 3. Arguably, had they never committed these 3 mistakes, we might still be bowing down to a king. So fortunately, they did. All right, so the 3 big mistakes consist of number 1, the Stamp Act. Now, when I say stamp, I don't mean stamp that you put on an envelope and you mail out. No. A stamp at that time was essentially a tax. So when you go to HEB today or any type of store, you're going to flip over the item to see how much it is, right? Think of that as a stamp, right? So the king had just finished fighting a bunch of wars, and wars cost money. Britain was broke. So what did? They tried to get money out of the colonies, the 13 provincial colonies in America. And they instituted the Stamp Act. Now imagine this. Imagine you went to AT&T to get a phone. And today it costs, I'm just hypothetical, guys, $50. And if you sign a contract, right? And you're like, woo, I got a new iPhone. But then what if you go back the next day and that same phone that you've been charged $50 for was suddenly $5,000? You would say, whoa, pump the brakes. Nope, never mind. That's essentially what the Stamp Act did. It raised taxes, raised money on certain items. Now, these are the items that they initially instituted the Stamp Act on. Now, think about who this targets. Paper, playing cards. What 2 groups used paper a lot during this time period in the mid-1700s and playing cards? Lawyers and sailors. So 2 populations, 2 groups that arguably you don't want to make mad, right? But they did. So there was, and this is actually, let me move my big old head. This is actually what the stamp looked like, okay? The second thing that they did was they instituted what's called the Declaratory Act. Now, think about the root word there, declare. This allowed the king to declare anything that he wanted because he essentially got mad. He got huffy puffy, stomped his king feet because people pushed back on the Stamp Act. They said, we're not going to pay that. That's absurd. Why would we pay that? So you all already know something that the colonists did. In fact, we all learned about it in elementary school. It has to do with tea. Y'all know what I'm talking about? The Boston Tea Party, right? So that was one of the things that instituted or triggered the king to institute the Declaratory Act. Was a bunch of people got together, men, and they dressed as Mohawk Indians, okay? Now, the stories that we probably learned in elementary school give us the scene that they were hooting and hollering and they're like, woo, we're not paying this. And they dramatically pushed everything to the ocean. There was a fire and just chaos, right? That's far, 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 far from the truth, guys. History is exciting, but it's not always that exciting. So the truth of the matter is, from diary accounts, the men didn't want to take away from the message that they were trying to send the king. So they told each other, they came to an agreement that they would not hoot and holler. They wouldn't take any of the tea. They wouldn't steal anything from the boat. And they would just simply plop, plop, plop the tea into the ocean. And that's what they did. In fact, one diary account stated that there's always one, right, that tried to steal tea by putting it into his trousers. And they got so mad at him that they stripped him down naked and made him walk home. Now that's Boston in the winter. That had to be a not fun walk home. But nonetheless, when the king found that out, that they would rather dump merchandise into the ocean as opposed to paying a tax, he flipped out. And that's when he declared the Declaratory Act, saying that he could institute any law, any act, any tax that he wanted, and he did. And people got even more upset, right? Um, it eventually led to what's known as the Coercive Act, also known as the Intolerable Act of 1774. Now, to give you some imagery as to how violent this got, the king would send essentially a taxman to go collect taxes from the different colonies. And one account by John Adams, who you guys should recognize that name, John Adams, one of our founding fathers, later to be president, he was witnessing this mob who was crowding around one of the taxmen who was coming down off a boat. And they were livid, and he knew something bad was going to happen, and indeed it did. They stripped down the taxman naked. I don't know what their deal was with always stripping down people naked, but that was their thing. So they stripped him down naked, put boiling hot tar all over his body, and dragged him through the streets. Now, boiling hot tar, that makes your skin basically melt off. So John Adams' account is horrific of this poor taxman that was basically skinned. And shockingly, I believe he lived. But the message that was showing the king was that, hey, these people are not happy. So he eventually sent soldiers into the colonies. And what he did as punishment, and why it's considered the Intolerable Act, was they actually stopped any merchandise from coming in or going out of the ports. Well, think about it. Think about today. How much do we get from China? How much do we get from other countries in terms of imports, and how much do we export? If all of that stopped today, what would we have? That would jeopardize our food, our clothing, our technology, even our trash, because we export a lot of trash, unfortunately. So the imposition that the king was placing on the colonies was indeed coercive and intolerable. And it was arguably the last straw, right? Last but not least, the king instituted, and I said there's 3 big mistakes, but the Murder Act is just kind of what they say in Louisiana, lagniappe, a little extra. So the Murder Act allowed soldiers, allowed people representing the king to kill those that posed a threat. And it doesn't say physical threat in the papers, okay? It can be just a threat to their status even, a threat to the status quo. And they would not be charged for murder. So all of these things just added and added and added to the aggression, to the frustration, and to the anger and the resentment that was building within these 13 colonies. And this is actually what King George III said. He said in the Declaratory Act, I say, I can pass any law on you lot, and there's not a thing you can do about it. Now, I'm sorry, guys, my English accent is just not there. I tried, right? But needless to say, it was a big deal. So we entered the American Revolution. Spoiler alert, we won. But at that time, I think there's this misperception that we just instantly became the United States of America and everybody was like skipping and dancing and singing Kumbaya. That is far, far from the truth. We had 13 100% divided colonies. Pennsylvania versus Connecticut, they almost got into a civil war. So we think of the Civil War typically between the North and the South, right? Before that was even a twinkle in anybody's eye, Pennsylvania almost got into a war with Connecticut over how much Connecticut and Pennsylvania were charging each other for what they considered importing and exporting merchandise, because they didn't consider each other as part of the same country, as part of the same unit. You had colonies with different currencies. Some colonies took pesos, some took British pounds still. They spoke different languages. So there was very different mechanisms in place that created division between these 13 colonies. So the ultimate question was, how do we fix it? And more importantly, what do we do? Because now we're broke. Because remember, fighting wars cost money. So we just fought this massive American Revolutionary War, which costs a lot of dough, and now we're broke, right? Because we borrowed a lot of money from France, by the way, in order to win the American Revolution. So we can thank our French buddies for that. But we were ultimately broke. And one of the ways in which a country can get money is to tax. But do you think they really wanted to tax their colonists after they just fought a war that was pretty much based on taxes? That's a tough sell, right? So they convened, the 13 delegates, meaning representatives of these colonies, convened, they got together, and their first order of business was to elect a king. So they asked George Washington to be king. And I really can't emphasize enough just what a wonderful, remarkable thing he did, which is he said no. Now, really think about that. If somebody offered you power on a silver platter and said, here, would you be able to say no? This was such a remarkable stance that at the time, Napoleon, little Napoleon, right, who tried to take over the world, on his deathbed, he said, they wanted me to be another Washington, which essentially he was saying they didn't want him to continually grasp for power. They wanted him to be able to renounce power, right? So George Washington set the stage for democracy, arguably. He did not want to be king. In fact, he didn't even want to be president. If you ever have a chance to read his diaries, do so. He was a remarkably depressed man. And I don't mean to laugh, but you read some of his diary accounts and you'll just want to have a glass of wine and give him a hug. He had a rough life. So they convened in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia initially was not intended to be a place where they got together and created the United States Constitution. In fact, the initial motivation was for the founding fathers to get together to revise the Articles of Confederation. Now, the Articles of Confederation were, and I'm trying to find a nice word to say this, but they were poo. They were not good, right? Essentially, they had all these things, but there was no teeth to the Articles of Confederation, meaning instead of requiring people to pay taxes, they asked them to pay taxes. So let me ask you, if I asked you, hey, do you mind giving like 8% on that item in taxes? You don't have to, but would you say yes? No, most people say no, thanks, I want to save the money, right? Well, that's what they were dealing with. They were dealing with a document that had a lot of things that they could ask for, but nothing was essentially required. So bad document. Now, Abraham Lincoln has a great quote, which I love. He said, "We the people are the rightful masters of both Congress and the courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men who pervert the Constitution." Amazing, beautiful. That should make your heart happy, guys. Essentially, the United States Constitution was born out of the will child of our founding fathers who sought a union that reflected the voice of the people, right? Now, it initially consisted of 7 parts, a preamble, and 6 articles. Now, what's missing there? The Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights wasn't in there, guys. It was not in there. So have you ever heard the saying, "I smell a rat"? Well, that saying came from the fact that the very first thing, other than asking George Washington to be president or to be king, that the founding fathers did when they convened in Philadelphia was they made the entire process secret. Now, really think about that. You have colonists who just fought in the American Revolutionary War, who are very distrustful of monarchy, very distrustful of any type of status monarchy resembling infrastructure. And now you're telling them that a bunch of guys are getting together, but you can't know what they're going to do in order to restructure your entire life, your entire government, your entire country. Do you think people were happy with that? No. Can you imagine if they had Facebook at that time? That would have been chaos. Lots of people were upset. In fact, that's where the saying, "I smell a rat" stems from, is there were arguments that the founding fathers were simply trying to grab at power for themselves. And so the only reason why we have a United States Constitution today is because the founding fathers went back to their constituents, essentially, their delegates, their colonies, and they promised them that if they ratified the United States Constitution in its original form, that they would come back in 3 years and implement a Bill of Rights, which gave power to the people, gave protections to us, the people. And had they not promised that and followed through on their promise, we would never have had a United States Constitution because the people simply didn't trust them. Okay, we now look at the founding fathers as these like, woo, rock stars. Back then, they were not so. They were very distrusted, and people questioned and were extremely suspicious of what they were doing, and rightfully so after what they had just experienced, right? So let's look at what the Constitution looked like in its original form. This is how I want you to practice this, guys. When I say one, I want you to say Congress. When I say two, president, three, courts. So let's practice. Article number 2, president. What about Article 3? Courts. Article 1, Congress. So if you have a question about, can the president do that? What article do you look at? Dose 2. So the first, second, and third articles essentially divides powers and provides powers to our 3 branches of government, right? Now, in Article, let me go back here. In Article 6, you see it says, it declares the Constitution the supreme law of the land. This supremacy law that's put in place is there for a reason. It essentially is saying that, let's say if Texas wants to forbid people from saying the word purple, they can't do that. Why? It conflicts with the United States Constitution, First Amendment, right to freedom of speech. So if any state law, if any city ordinance, if anything at the state or lower level conflicts with the federal law, meaning the United States Constitution and its Bill of Rights, then guess who wins? Every time, the United States Constitution. Knockout, right? So just remember, the United States Supremacy Clause guarantees that the United States Constitution will always win out if something comes into conflict with it. So how did it become the supreme law of the land, meaning the final word? Who said that the United States Constitution is the final word? Or more ultimately, more importantly, the United States Supreme Court. Who gave them that power, right? Now I want you to read this with me. This is Article 3, which governs you should have said courts, the courts. It says the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish, blah, 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 blah. Do you see anything about the Supreme Court having the ultimate say-so? Nope. Nor does it say anything about the number of justices that have to be on the court, just FYI. So who gave them that power? Funny enough, they themselves did. So in a very famous case, which you need to know for the exam, Marbury versus Madison. This case established, perk up your ears, the concept of judicial review. Judicial review. Now, at the time, you had Adams, who was a staunch Federalist. He believed in the power of the federal government, having the power to regulate the states. But on the other end of that spectrum, you had Jackson coming on board, and he was not a Federalist. He was a staunch anti-Federalist, believed in states' rights over the federal government. He didn't trust the federal government, right? So you kind of see some themes. You still see the same arguments today. So history has a tendency to repeat itself, right? So to know history is to have knowledge and power. So just be aware of that. But before he officially went into his presidency, Adams did what's called the midnight judicial run, which is he appointed as many Federalist judges as he humanly could. They didn't have email then, guys. They didn't have cell phones. So he sent a dude on horseback to go serve these appointmentships to all these various judges. Well, the story goes that this individual did what many of us probably have done at one point in time in our lives, which is they stop in for a drink with some friends and they say, oh, I'm just going to have one. Do they ever just have one? No. So he ended up not serving out the rest of the appointmentships. And the next morning, guess who comes on board? The anti-Federalist. He sees that the courts are stacked with these Federalist judges and he is ticked off. He is not a happy camper. Well, in this case, they didn't serve out this last appointmentship. And the question was, does he have to recognize this last unserved appointment for this Federalist judge? And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't make a president do that. He has the power, he or she has the power or authority to deny or approve such appointments. And here he had the power to deny it, right? But they also slipped in something very interesting. They also said that they have the power to say what the law is. Okay, so allows the Supreme Court to determine what the law is. That's judicial review. Without this decision, there would be no Supreme Court holdings that we would explore or study at all. It was because of this case that we have Supreme Court holdings that all of you, I'm sure, know at least one or two or three that guide how we approach specific things like voting. You name it, it's in there. Speaking, protesting, all these things are in place because the Supreme Court has had some type of say-so on it at some point in time. So now we have the first set of government limitations, right? But no Bill of Rights, none. All we had were these individual rights. There's only 3 individual rights within the United States Constitution's original form, meaning before the United States Bill of Rights came into effect, there's only 3 individual rights. The first is the writ of habeas corpus. So this is when a person is in prison, but they have no idea why, okay? So it would be as if they arrest me, they throw me in prison, and they say, Professor Shaw, you're not getting out. You know what you did. Well, no, I don't know what I did, right? Why am I being punished? I don't know why. That's the writ of habeas corpus. The second one is no bill of attainder. So this is when somebody is in prison and they know why, they know, but they've never had a chance to defend themselves. Now, this is an interesting one because the founding fathers were smart, but they didn't create everything out of thin air. Some of the concepts that we have in place stem from what they knew, which was the law in England. Now, in England, we had King Henry VIII at one time, right? So for those of you who are not familiar with King Henry VIII, he had many wives and they did not meet very good ends, right? So one of those is Anne Boleyn. He was first married to a beautiful queen from Spain, but they never could have children. And he was angry and huffy puffy. So he wanted a divorce, which at that time the Catholic Church said, we don't believe in that. So he broke apart and he got a divorce and he got married to Anne Boleyn. Now, Anne Boleyn was very vivacious, very intelligent, and at the same token, though, could not bear him a male heir, right? So he accused her of sleeping with her brother, which documentation shows that was not true, and committing some type of treason. So they imprisoned her in this tower, but they never gave her a true opportunity to defend herself, right? So that's where the concept of no bill of attainder comes from. Pretty cool, right? So the last one is no ex post facto law. So this is when the government tries to punish an act that was innocent when done. So what does that look like? It's legal to smoke cigarettes as long as you're over the age of 18, right? And in certain areas. You can't like light up in here. Now, by the way, I remember my freshman year in college. This shows you how old I am. But my criminology professor from Mississippi, he would smoke like a chimney in our class. And people would chew tobacco and spit it in cups and bleh, right? And I used to smoke way too much. Awful, awful habit. But nonetheless, legal. So what if they tomorrow say, if you smoke cigarettes, you will serve 10 years in prison? And you quit, you don't touch a cigarette tomorrow. However, they arrest you for smoking a cigarette the day before. They can't do that. Why? Because it was legal yesterday. That's an example of implementing an ex post facto law. You can't punish an act that was innocent when done. Now, habeas corpus also has been suspended in our nation's history, and each time that it has been suspended has been a pretty bad reflection of our nation. Lincoln suspended it once when they imprisoned a bunch of Confederate soldiers. meaning they imprisoned them, but they didn't know why they were still in prison after the war. Then the second time was during World War II, when our nation imprisoned in many camps throughout primarily the West and the South, Japanese Americans. They not only put them in incarceration camps, but they took away their bank accounts, took their businesses, closed their businesses, took all their properties, took everything away from them, even though they were American citizens. In fact, one of the largest ones is in Wichita City, which is not far from here, guys. Okay, so again, I described King Henry VIII, and that's actually the tower that Anne Boleyn was sent to. If you ever get a chance to go, you should. And again, ex post facto laws. Now, there's only one crime listed in the United States Constitution. Anybody want to guess what it is? Treason. That's the only crime that's listed in the entire United States Constitution. So you guys don't have to know what it entails. You just have to know that it's in there. All right, so I'm gonna stop here and I'm gonna make a second video for you to watch that goes into the Bill of Rights, but I kind of want to give you all a little breather. So take a break, go have some coffee, wine, both, I don't know. But in any event, stop here and revisit it here in a second.